In April of 2016, the UN held the United Nations General Assembly's Special Session on Drugs, or UNGASS for short. It was the first time in over 18 years that the UN sat down and discussed the global war on drugs. Initially, this UNGASS was set to 2019, but through a joint effort, Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala requested that the UN would bring forward the convention and conduct an in-depth review, analyzing all available options, including regulatory or market measures, in order to establish a new paradigm that would impede the flow of resources to organized crime groups.
Ante las limitaciones del paradigma prohibicionista, se debe atender el tema mundial de las drogas desde la perspectiva de los derechos humanos.
In the light of the UNGASS, we traveled to New York to learn about the drug reform movement, a movement consisting of various human rights organizations, all pushing to end the global war on drugs.
The drug reform movement really, there are some actors in our movement that have been around for decades, that have been at the UNGASS in 1998 and before, and were engaged in drug policy, but we're relatively a young movement.
This week, across the street is the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, and it's the first time in almost 2 decades that we've had such a meeting. The last one was in 1998. And at that time, the slogan was, "A drug-free world, we can do it," which is far from having been achieved and also a completely unrealistic aim. And in the last, almost 20 years since then, things have changed. We're no longer talking about a drug-free world. I mean, it's kind of shifted to now a society free of drug abuse. And I think the big change is that there are more and more countries that are there expressing dissent, saying they're not happy with the status quo, especially from Latin America and Europe. But ultimately, change is very, very slow to come to the UN.
To better understand the movement and the war on drugs, one must start by understanding the sentiments that caused it in the first place.
So drugs have been have evolved in tandem with society for tens of thousands of years. And so archaeological records show that cannabis and coca have been around for thousands of years and used by communities for traditional uses or for spiritual uses as well. And so for most of human history, drugs went largely unregulated, where people were consuming things like cannabis or coca or psychedelic mushrooms and such. And so it's only in recent, the last 100 years or so, where we've really seen international drug policy evolve.
The first drug laws were targeted at people who looked like me in San Francisco in the 1870s. And it was designed to basically suppress Chinese labor markets and immigration at a time when there was a great recession going on. The railroads had been finished, so there wasn't much need for the Chinese labor. They were competing with white Irish labor. And so it was a legal way to harass and repress Chinese communities. And the way they did it was by using very racist and sexualized images. So the newspapers, for instance, would have these cartoons of drug fiend Chinese people seducing white women in opium dens. So this idea of white women and sexual purity comes up over and over and over again in the U.S. drug war. And in fact, the early laws against cannabis, as well as heroin and cocaine, stigmatized various ethnic communities. And again, the idea was that Mexican-American immigrants were going to smoke marijuana. That's why we call it marijuana instead of cannabis, was to give it a stigmatizing Spanish name. And they were going to rape white women. Similarly, in the South, the cartoons in the newspapers at the time were of drug-crazed Negroes. Black men were going to rape white women because of their cocaine or their heroin. And it's one of the reasons the Southern sheriffs went from a 32 caliber bullet to a 38 caliber bullet, because they thought the small bullet would not be enough to stop a drug-crazed Negro. So again and again, the racism and repression of certain demographic groups, undesirable groups, was used to justify a war on drugs.
even as international treaties were developed in the 1960s and pushed, there was still relatively lax enforcement of drug laws across the world. It wasn't until the 1970s when Richard Nixon declared that drugs were public enemy number one, and at that point we consider the launching of the war on drugs, where they use that terminology. And this has come out recently from information that was discussed by some of Nixon's former staff. John Ehrlichman said, well, basically we knew the drugs weren't harmful, but we wanted to target African Americans, and we wanted to target anti-war protesters, anti-Vietnam War protesters. And so if we linked the anti-war people with cannabis and we linked the blacks with cocaine, and heroin, we knew we could target them and prohibit those drugs and then disrupt those communities.
If you look at the incarceration rates in the United States, they were fairly steady throughout the 20th century. Whether it's the Great Depression, World War I, the Red Scare, nothing could move this incarceration rate. Suddenly, civil rights started happening in the South. And then you see the drug laws and the incarceration rates start to rise slowly at first and then skyrocketing. As we ended legal oppression of African Americans through racist Jim Crow laws, as they were called, they looked for other ways to suppress those communities, and drugs were an obvious way to do that.
When Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, we became warriors. And it took law enforcement out of that mission of serving their constituents. You know, we're not drug warriors. That's what the military does. We're not supposed to. We don't have rules of engagement like the military does. Yet we implemented some of the same type of tactics in our community.
When the police crack down on a market and they take a dealer off that street corner, what they've done is create a job opportunity. They opened up a valuable piece of real estate. An open drug market is valuable because that's where people know to go to buy drugs. And so then the rival gangs come in and they fight, and that's where the violence comes from. The gangs cannot go to a judge and resolve their disputes as normal commerce would, because it's illegal. They can't go to a judge and say, Your Honor, I've been dealing drugs in this city for 15 years, and this upstart gang took over my corner. Please kick them out. They can't do that. So the only way they can settle their differences is with violence or threats of extreme violence. They shoot it out.
Porque vivos se los llevaron. Vivos los queremos. Porque vivas se las llevaron. Vivas las queremos. ¿Dónde están? ¿Dónde están nuestros hijos? ¿Dónde están? ¿Dónde están? ¿Dónde están? Nuestras hijas, ¿dónde están? Porque vivos se los llevaron. Vivos los queremos. Porque vivos se los llevaron. Vivos los queremos.
When it comes to the drug war and to the enforcement of drug strategies, we cannot arrest our way out of that issue. And the resources that we use to try to do so would be better spent on things like public health strategies or maybe violence reduction units instead of narcotics units.
Well, a lot of money goes into this war, so it means also a lot of people benefit from this war. And in the US, we have an entire prison industrial complex where the private prisons have gained so much, as they themselves call so many clients, through this war. And the kind of prison associations have explicitly come out against any loosening of almost any laws, but specifically drug laws, because they will lose their clients, and they see it completely as a business model. And they also have a lot of lobbying power in Washington, D.C.
We spend a lot of money on the back end of the system. For example, in California, where I live right now, since we gave prison guards a raise, by the end of the next 3 years, it will cost $70,000 US a year to house one inmate in 1 year of state prison. That's the equivalent of a private university education at the University of Southern California that would include all your meals, your books, your housing, and your tuition. And so why are we waiting to invest those important resources not at the beginning when we can really change the dynamics of communities?
As we keep throwing policing and militarized resources at this, the types of people we capture are typically the people who are dumb enough to get caught. All right? They violated their own operational security. They stayed on the cell phone too long. They bragged too much about their wealth. They picked turf battles with rivals. They spent their money in flashy ways. They slipped up. They got careless, and they got apprehended. Conversely, if you do this decade after decade, the types of people we generally miss are the people who are the most innovative, the most cunning, the smartest. We create tremendous efficiency in this market through law enforcement. So we've had this filtering effect. We basically weed out the inefficient traffickers and reward the efficient ones. They take over that market space. If I tried to design a system that's worse than this, I couldn't do it. It's very difficult because we create an incentive structure for drug traffickers so that when we hear about all the violence involved in drug trafficking, whether it's in Mexico or on the streets of our cities or whatever, people are fighting and killing over the right to distribute what are essentially minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities. These drugs, whether it's cocaine, heroin, cannabis, are easy to produce, easy to grow. They should cost pennies per dose. Same with synthetic drugs. It's our policies of prohibition that create tremendous value where there really shouldn't be any. And we have succeeded where the alchemists of the Middle Ages failed. They tried to find a formula to turn lead into gold. We find a formula to turn vegetable matter into the equivalent of gold, basically. So much so that people are willing to butcher each other and do all kinds of obscene things for the right to distribute and control that market.
During the preparation for UNGASS, organizations deeply involved in drug policy had to face the fact that getting a voice in the UN debate wouldn't be easy. For many key organizations, that meant getting only a handful of people inside.
During the preparations for UNGASS, nearly 200 civil society organizations from around the world were literally shut out of decisive meetings. UNGASS itself excluded the voice of civil society. It was unable to accommodate the desire for change. The problem is that UNGASS is out of step with realities on the ground. As more and more national, state and municipal governments pursue progressive approaches, including regulation, the more they will show the inherent flaws of the international drug control regime.
Protecting young people has always been a major selling point for the war on drugs. Though according to the most recent FBI data, more than 40% of the people arrested for drugs are under the age of 25. However, when it comes to discussing the policies directly affecting them, they are often excluded from the debate, causing big frustration for the young people pushing for a drug reform.
They don't want you here. They don't want you to speak. They don't want to hear your voice because they want to believe that what they're doing is good for you. Well, guess what? The drug war harms youth. The drug war harms all of us. And we're not going to sit around and let people decide what's best for us when we can speak for ourselves.
The demonstration is about to raise voices and make young people more visible in terms of decision making, because UNGASS 2016 is the meeting for, and they have a very big tagline on it that it's in order to make a better future for young people. So, well, if you cannot make a better future for young people if young people are not involved directly.
I mean, the hope for me is to legalize all drugs, and this conversation could go on forever, but the hope is for one day to really look at ourselves with compassion, science, and health, and no longer discriminate against one another because of fear.
I can't be too optimistic about the policy changes at the UN. I just really don't think too much is going to change, but I think with increasing awareness and discussion that the rhetoric and the narrative surrounding the war on drugs will be improved. Yeah.
The people united will never be divided. The people united will never be divided. Let's go. The people united will never be divided. Let's go. The people united will never be divided. Let's go.
You know, they always say that the youth is very, I guess, passive, and I don't think it's true. I think, if anything, Bernie Sanders is proof that the youth, once given an opportunity to mobilize and the space to do so, will do it, and they will rise up.
Outside the walls, hear the youth calling. The powers that be remain stalling, but they cannot ignore our presence. They cannot ignore our voices. They will hear the youth calling. They must hear the youth calling. They are hearing the youth calling. Now line up behind me. Cut this drug war's lifeline!
I hope we make some strides and some progress, but it seems that the world leaders are very hesitant in moving drug policy forward in a positive note.
According to the civil society, the UNGASS was a failure. In response to the outcome document, which paradoxically was drafted a month before UNGASS had even begun, 195 civil society organizations from across the globe released a statement, stating that the UNGASS process had failed to recognize the lack of progress achieved by international drug control over the past 50 years. The statement went on to describe the preparatory process as non-inclusive and non-transparent.
We're very disappointed with the outcome, because the forces that really want the more repressive approaches, they dominated a lot of the conversation and ultimately kind of held the debate hostage, and the better forces in the end kind of felt that they had to sign on to something that it wasn't perfect. So, you know, it's a big disappointment for civil society. There are small gains, but I think things are happening much quicker in the world than what's happening in the United Nations.
I think all the speeches and all the statements from the various member states have made it very clear that this consensus is broken, fundamentally broken. The world is moving in two different directions. There are the progressive-minded reform states, and there are the regressive states who think the key is being even tougher. And we're ending up with two different worlds now.
It's still a taboo topic, and there's still so many countries that are wedded to the status quo and repressive approaches that it's not yet politically completely comfortable to come out on this. So I would say we need public opinion to shift, we need media to shift, and we need that to create an environment where politicians feel not only comfortable doing this, but that it would be a political cost for them not to do it.
I think many countries will learn to treat people more humanely and recognize people's humanities, and realize that punishment is not the way to deal with health issues. For what other forms of public health problems do we use police, prisons, prosecutors as the primary means of making people healthy? To me, this is like treating clinical depression with a baseball bat. You know, smile or beat you again. You cannot coerce people into being happier or healthier.
I would just urge people who are on the fence about it to think about whether they think this approach has been working, and if not, to consider a more humane and compassionate approach that has to do with empathy rather than control and punishment, because punishment may seem like a good idea in theory, but it doesn't work. It's not a deterrent, and throwing people in jail for this never works to either solve drug use problems or reduce the availability of drugs.
In many ways, we've been declaring a war against individual actors. So when you think about all these individuals involved in the drug economy around the world, whether it's drug trafficking, money laundering, growing, being mules or using or whatever, there is no international high command of the drug war that says, the drug economy, that says, okay, we've had enough, we finally surrender. All you users stop using, growers stop growing, everyone stop trafficking, just everyone stop now. That will never happen. We have literally been waging a war against an enemy who is incapable of surrendering. We will never get a coherent capitulation as you would from an enemy army. right? So this is by definition a forever war, and people are getting war weary. They're experiencing war weariness.
I think we're living in the end of days of the war on drugs. It's one of these things, like the decline of the Roman Empire. You're living in it, and you maybe don't see it quite so obviously up close. But little by little, history is going to look back and see some turning points where society, the consensus around how to deal with international drug control is now broken. For many years, the countries of the world marched along in close order around many of the ways to address the problems of drugs. And now there's a lot of frustration about how we're doing. So I think we're seeing the system being pushed to the limits.
I'm here because I know there's going to be real change. Our voices are being echoed. And from this day forth, they're going to know that the drug war is going to be eradicated by us.
In the last few years, we've seen an unprecedented rate of drug policy reform on different initiatives. Again, Europe was kind of the leader in harm reduction policies in the 80s and 90s. And now in the Americas, marijuana reform is really taken off. In the United States, criminal justice reform is a huge topic. And I don't think that's going to go backwards. I think public opinion has shifted, and people care about this issue, and it's now in the mainstream kind of consciousness in a lot of countries. So I see it moving forward, but at different rates in different countries.
I'm not going to say it's going to be gone in 10 years or 20. It might take a while to finally kill the beast for good, but we're going to see an evolution. It's inevitable. We're going to see an evolution in how we deal with drugs in that frame.